Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today as we launch IDMC's 7th Global Report on Internal Displacement, this year with a special focus on internally displaced children and youth. It is my pleasure to present the key findings, take stock of the scale of this global challenge, and look together at the opportunities ahead. I would like to start by highlighting that despite the yearly variations, internal displacement has not seen a decline in the last decade. Last year, we recorded 38 million internal displacements, or movements, the second highest annual figure in a decade after 2020's record-breaking year of disaster displacement. These trends should be a major cause of concern, especially considering that they are set to continue increasing in 2022, as many crises are still ongoing, and the war in Ukraine has displaced nearly 8 million people since February. Conflict and violence led to 14.4 million movements in 2021. This is the highest figure we have ever recorded. It was largely driven by the crisis in northern Ethiopia, ongoing violence in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. Across these three countries, the figures were also the highest ever recorded. A sharp increase in internal displacement also took place in Myanmar, where a military takeover reignited long-running conflicts and sparked armed resistance. Across all these crises, food insecurity remains concerning, and the situation for many IDPs has not been resolved. Sub-Saharan Africa was the region most affected, accounting for more than 80% of the global total internal displacements by conflict and violence. This is also the highest figure we have ever recorded in this region. Beyond Ethiopia and the DRC, Burkina Faso, Somalia, and the Central African Republic all recorded high numbers. Drought, food insecurity, and attacks against civilians were some of the main factors that pushed millions from their homes, sometimes repeatedly. Conversely, displacement in the Middle East and North Africa region in 2021 was the lowest in 10 years, as conflict in Syria, Libya, and Iraq de-escalated, though violence continued in Yemen and reignited in Palestine. However, across this region, the overall number of people still uprooted as of the end of the year remained high, as IDPs have not found a durable solution to their displacement. Supporting long-term peace-building and development initiatives is more needed than ever in this region that remains affected by protracted displacement. Moving on to disasters and the impacts of climate change, we recorded 23.7 million internal displacements in 2021. Although figures were lower than the previous years, the overall trends mirrored the decade trends, with China, the Philippines, and India being some of the most affected countries. Many of the movements were in the form of preemptive evacuations, which are a life-saving measure, but the extent of housing destruction in many of the disasters that we recorded throughout the year suggests that many IDPs also face the prospect of prolonged displacement. Also mirroring previous years, highly exposed and densely populated areas across the East Asia and Pacific region were the most affected. Nearly 60% of the total disaster displacement was recorded in this region alone, where figures were the highest since 2016. In terms of other regions, the Atlantic hurricane season and the rainy seasons across South Asia and Africa were less severe than the year before, leading to less movements. However, the phenomenon still occurred in around 70% of the world countries and territories, which demonstrate its global footprint. Drought conditions and extreme temperatures triggered wildfires in the Middle East and North Africa, the Americas, and Europe. Some areas of the US and the Mediterranean experienced their hottest summer on record. Countries including Australia, Canada, and Germany suffered widespread floods, reminding us that high-income countries are equally exposed to disaster displacement. Weather-related hazards accounted for 94% of the total disaster displacements. However, geophysical hazards such as earthquakes and volcanic eruptions were significant drivers of internal displacement in 2021. The Nyiragongo volcanic eruption in the DRC triggered an estimated 600,000 movements. It was the volcanic eruption triggering the highest number of displacements globally since data has been available, and also affected those uprooted by conflict and violence in the province of North Kivu. So be it in the DRC, Afghanistan, Somalia, or South Sudan, we are observing a trend in which conflicts and disasters are colliding. Their compounding impacts are functioning as drivers of further vulnerability and displacement risk. Despite the figures in this report being presented in separate metrics, overlapping crises had a severe knock-on effect on food security and heightened the vulnerability of millions. This is a trend we're seeing today, as we speak, in the Horn of Africa, where drought, food insecurity, and conflict are overlapping, pushing a high number of people into displacement. The war in Ukraine is also having significant impacts on food and oil prices, which is having impacts at a global scale, also affecting the lives of IDPs. This chart shows a different metric, which is the total number of IDPs as of end of the year. And as you can see, we are observing an increasing trend. Last year, we estimated that 59.1 million people were internally displaced globally by both conflict and disasters. The figure is an all-time high and was more than 4 million higher than the previous year, and the equivalent of the population of Italy. A significant proportion of those displaced have been living in a situation of protracted displacement, especially in Syria, the DRC, and Colombia, that continue to host the largest number of IDPs, followed by Afghanistan and Yemen. At least 5.9 million have been uprooted by disasters, but this is only the third year we have produced such a figure. And given the lack of data, it should be considered a significant underestimate. Much more is needed to strengthen our collective efforts to lower these ever-increasing trends and prevent and address protracted crises. Another key finding of this year's grid is that the direct economic impacts of internal displacement worldwide were estimated to amount to more than $21 billion in 2021. This includes the cost of providing every IDP with support to their housing, education, health, and security, and accounts for the loss of income for 1 year of displacement. It is not taking into consideration the longer-term financial implications for IDPs, host communities, and governments more broadly, and should therefore be considered also conservative. It is difficult to disentangle whether the COVID-19 pandemic caused, prolonged, or worsened a particular crisis. What we do know is, as countries restricted movement to fight the spread of the virus, displaced populations bore the brunt of the impacts on their income, food security, and access to services. This, in turn, hampered many to return home or move onwards to safe havens. This year's report has a special focus on internally displaced children and youth, and look at how displacement affects young people's safety, health, and education, as well as longer-term social and economic repercussions for future generations. These impacts are unfortunately visible today in Yemen, where deteriorating conditions have left millions of children malnourished, or in Afghanistan, where many displaced children and youth are still deprived from education, or in Ukraine, where 2/3 of the country's child population have been uprooted. Around 33 million, or more than half of the world internally displaced people, are young people under the age of 25. Many children are uprooted for years, and some young adults spend their entire childhood in displacement. Displacement can undermine their development, set them back in fulfilling their potential, and erode their resilience to future shocks. The impacts of displacement vary depending on their age, gender, and other characteristics. The repercussions extend beyond the individual to their family and community for the years to come. What I'm going to present on the next slides is the overall top findings of the report. We have heard some very interesting interventions in this morning's session, and we will hear more throughout the panel regarding what comes next, what comes in the future. So, starting by protection, displaced children are at a higher risk of violence, abuse, exploitation, and neglect. They may become separated from their families during their flight, and if they lose their identity documents, it may be difficult to reunite them with their families. The financial difficulties IDPs tend to face may force children to engage in dangerous income-generating activities, including crime, transactional sex, or joining armed groups. Girls are a particular risk of gender-based violence, as has been documented in Haiti, while boys face greater risk of recruitment into armed groups, as has been documented in South Sudan. Strengthening child protection systems that consider these risks is essential. Evidence on IDPs' health and access to medical services shows that they tend to face greater challenges and worst health outcomes. Malnutrition rates may be particularly high for displaced children, even in areas where food insecurity is a wider challenge. Malnutrition impedes physical and cognitive development and has been associated with lower levels of education and social and economic productivity in adulthood. Poor living conditions, lack of clean water and sanitation, and reduced access to preventative measures and healthcare increase the risk of communicable diseases among displaced children and youth. Displacement can also interrupt vaccination programs, as has been the case in Syria, where immunization rates fell by around 46% from 2010 to 2017, leading to a resurgence of polio. Beyond the physical impacts, internal displacement can have negative outcomes on children's psychological well-being. Displaced children and youth, are largely equipped to deal with the equipped to deal with the disruption and trauma caused by displacement. There are promising steps, however. Countries including Bangladesh, Colombia, Sri Lanka, and Kenya, and I'm just here naming a few, have national laws and policies on internal displacement that recognize displaced children's need for psychological support, providing access to meaningful opportunities, a sense of connectedness, and agency in decision-making are some of the long-term investments needed to support them overcoming stress and trauma. The displacement of children and youth has an immediate effect on their education too. It usually interrupts schooling, sometimes only for a few days or weeks, but in other cases for much longer periods of time. The cost of inaction in addressing all displaced children's access to education goes far beyond negative impacts in the short term. Each year of schooling is estimated to increase an individual's earning potential by 10% in many countries. Improved access to education builds appetite for local integration and helps to discourage IDPs from going back to underserved or unsafe areas of origin. Prolonged displacement can undermine their development and set them back in fulfilling their potential. A healthy and happy child is more likely to contribute to an equitable society and a functioning economy, which in turn reduces the risk of repeated displacement. And this is my last slide, and I wanted to focus, as always, we do in IDMC, regard to the data gaps and what is needed on the way forward. Because if we are to address all these challenges in the years to come, we need more and better data on internally displaced children and youth. Today, they are particularly invisible in global and national data, especially compared with those who cross an international border. Even when data is collected, Age groups are not standardized, making it difficult to compile national level figures. Each demographic group faces specific risks and has specific needs. Infants may need nutritional supplements, school-age children educational inputs, and young people vocational training. Gender, disability status, and other aspects also have a direct influence on how children experience displacement, but such data is even more challenging to come by. So more data is needed to better understand how direct and immediate effects on children and young people fuel broader long-term impacts on communities and societies. In the meantime, recognizing them as agents of change is vital to protect development gains and reduce the risk of protracted and future crises. Preparing for the world of tomorrow must therefore start with their active participation and leadership. So I would like to end by saying that the GRID report that those who are present, I hope all of you took your copies, and those who are online, of course, explored the landing page, but there's much more. We have also country pages, methodological annexes, and interacting datasets for you to download and play around with. So I invite everyone to explore all this data and content. Thank you very much.